So in some of the videos that we've watched so far today, it was intimated that one could discern when somebody is telling the truth by certain tells or by certain technology. And I would like to kind of revisit that implication through looking at the scientific evidence to suggest whether that really is true or not. So the place where we need to start is understanding the objective measures of lying, the most famous of which, of course, you've heard of is the polygraph test. But these tests are notoriously unreliable. As you can see in this situation, you've got innocent people and guilty people. And some innocent people are judged innocent by the polygraph, but some of them are judged guilty by the polygraph. And similarly, with the guilty people, you've got some judged innocent and some judged guilty. So you can see these orange, like this orange bar right here, are accurately innocent people who are judged innocent, and this blue bar is accurately guilty people who are judged guilty. However, we've got a false rate here of about 35% and a false rate here of about 25%. So our technology here is pretty poor at being able to discern whether somebody who's actually telling a lie is, or whether somebody's actually telling the truth is. Now, the reason why this happens is because a polygraph test is based on sympathetic nervous system arousal, like skin conductance, how much your palms are sweating, like your heart rate, and things like that. So you're hooked up to these monitors, and you're given baseline questions where you're trying to establish like what your level of arousal is in the situation generally. They ask you questions like, what's your name, what's your age, where you grew up, and things like that they know the answer to, so they can say, okay, this is the level of arousal that this person experiences when they're answering true questions. And then they pose to you questions about which you might be lying, interrogation questions. They ask you questions and see if, in response to those questions, if your physiological arousal is higher than it otherwise is in the baseline questions. So if it is higher, then they take that as a sign that your sympathetic nervous system is aroused because you're nervous about having lied. But there's all kinds of reasons somebody might be aroused. It could be because they're just nervous about having to answer these questions. It could be that they're nervous about being suspected of lying when they know they're not. Also, if you have pathological liars or sociopaths, they're very good at telling lies that they believe themselves, and so their sympathetic nervous systems are not aroused, even though they are lying. So that's the reason why we have such high error rates in this kind of test. Now, there are MRI tests right now that are being developed that can do a better job of telling when somebody's lying, but remember, MRI scans are pretty inconvenient. You have to put somebody in a scanner. They're very expensive. Each scan is at a minimum $500. And when you place them in the scanner, you might ask somebody these questions. It takes a long time. It's cumbersome to transport somebody from the police station, perhaps to a hospital where an MRI scanner exists. Once there, of course, there's always the risk that if this person is a pathological liar or a sociopath, that the brain regions that are associated with lying might not be activated in those individuals because they're so skilled at lying and because they believe their own lies. So it might not be the case that even an MRI would be any better than a simple polygraph test. We heard earlier in our lecture that there are certain kinds of things that are associated with telling the truth, with telling a lie. Like, for instance, you might choose different words that indicate you're lying. You might say, believe me, or trust me. You might avoid contractions, like did not, or I will not. You might use distancing language, as if to say, like in the example of Bill Clinton, that woman, rather than using her name. It's a way of dissociating yourself from the person or the situation that's being described. We also heard about body language that might indicate lying, like freezing your upper body in order to combat fidgeting, which might be a natural tendency when you're lying. So in order to overcompensate for that, you freeze your upper body. You might make more eye contact with fewer blinks. You might shake your head no while saying something affirmative. there might be a discrepancy between the affect of what you're describing, and the facts that are being conveyed. So your particular demeanor, your emotional state as you describe horrific events might be neutral or even positive. And you might exhibit this smile that's associated with duping delight. Remember, when you illustrate this smile, this is like a grin that you can't help displaying, that comes with the delight of thinking that you have tricked or duped somebody into believing you. Now, the problem with this evidence is that when students are exposed to these kinds of things, they're actually no better at telling lies, at discerning lies, than at any other time. We know this from one interesting study where, you remember this show perhaps called Lie to Me. It came on several years ago, and it lasted for a few seasons and ended abruptly. I was very disappointed because it was such a delightful show. But when this show was on, students watched it and would report anecdotally that they felt more confident in being able to discern the lies of other people around them. So researchers wanted to see whether they actually were better at discerning lies. In one experiment, they had some students watch Lie to Me, they had other students watch a different show, Numbers, and they had some students that didn't watch any show, and they just performed in the experiment. And they set up participants in this paradigm so that they would be doing some kind of gambling game where it was incentivized to tell a lie because you might get more money if you did. And then they had other participants observe the activity and try to tell when somebody was lying and when they weren't. Interestingly, the students who had watched Lie to Me were worse after watching the show than people who'd never watched any of the shows at telling lies. Now notice these are a little bit above chance. 60% is a little better than 50, but not a ton. They're not that accurate at telling lies. Now here's the reason why this ends up being a problem on the part of professional lie detectors, like the person that we heard about in our video earlier today. The problem is that there are, in any given situation, people giving either no signals of lying or giving lying signals. But these are juxtaposed against people actually telling the truth and people actually lying. In this cell right here, these are the cases that seem to prove that you can discern lies. So the lecturer in our TED Talk was describing how there are certain signs, we just described them, certain linguistic signs or certain body signs that indicate that somebody is actually lying, and if you give off those signs, then we certainly know that they're lying. These kinds of telltale signs are compared against situations where people are telling the truth and the individual is giving no signals that they're lying. So these are the cases against which you're comparing these lies. You're like, okay, somebody is giving these signals, they've actually lied. Okay, that looks good for us. This person telling the truth, they're giving no lying signals. Okay, that's a good comparison. We know that these people are lying because these people aren't, and they're not giving any signals. However, we're ignoring these other two comparison cases here, because sometimes people are lying and they're giving no signals of it. These are called misses, and you may never even discover that these cases exist. You might interrogate somebody, they give no signals of having lied, so you let them go and you assume that they told the truth even though they weren't. Sociopaths and pathological liars fall in this area. Now, we have to understand what's going on with sociopaths and pathological liars. So let me describe that in a little more detail. People become really good at lying to themselves with practice. The way that works is you hold two pieces of conflicting information in your head at the same time. And in order to believe your lie, you just have to pay attention to the one fact that you're talking about while ignoring the conflicting one. Pathological liars get so good at this self-deception that they can ignore all kinds of conflicting information, and they just hone in specifically on what they're saying in this moment. And they totally believe that thing they're saying right now, ignoring everything else in their mind. 5 minutes later, they might contradict what they just said now, But they're ignoring what they said 5 minutes ago, and they're focusing now on what they're saying now. And they're ignoring all the other things in their head that might conflict with that, and they're just honing in on that one thing. Now, interestingly, pathological liars have different brain chemistry and physiological structure than individuals who are just ordinary. Pathological liars have 25% more white matter, according to one study, and 14% less gray matter. Now, why is this important? White matter is the connective tissue in the brain. We learned about this a long time ago at the beginning of the course when we saw all the connective tracks of language, and we saw how associated language was across various areas of the brain. You saw this very colorful image in one of my presentations of all these lines going throughout the brain connecting different stuff. And people who are pathological liars have more of these connective tissues. They're better at making associations and keeping track of all the different kinds of things that they've said in the past. However, gray matter, which they have less of, is the computing power of the brain. That's where your critical thinking happens. And they have less of that. So they're worse at inhibiting themselves from telling lies. So they might remember that they've told a lie in the past, and they might remember who they told it to. But they are really bad at discerning in which situations they ought to lie and in which situations it's appropriate and how it might impact their relationships that they have with other people. And so pathological liars end up being found out pretty quickly. Everybody else knows that what they're saying is BS, and so they have poor relationships and they're more likely to lose their jobs and things like that. But they don't give off signals that they're lying because they believe their lies. And so even though they're lying, you might not ever detect that they've said a lie. And these cases are not detected. So they can't be compared against these kinds of cases that are proving your abilities. Now what's going on down here is we've got people who are telling the truth, but for whatever reason, because of their natural body language or because of their nervousness or something in a particular situation, they're giving off lying signals. These are called false positives. And people might ignore these because of confirmation bias, or they might assume that in fact the person is lying even though they're not, just because they're giving off lying signals. This happens, as we saw earlier, in the case of the polygraph test. We might convict somebody of being guilty even though they're telling the truth. And the only way you can know that they're telling the truth is if you have corroborating physical evidence to demonstrate that the truth actually exists. I mean, that this lying signal that you're picking up on actually doesn't corroborate the person telling you the fact of the matter that they're telling the truth. In most situations, all you know is whether the person didn't give or did give lying signals. You don't know whether they actually told the truth or not, because often that is only known to the person themselves. It's secret. It's only known to them. So you don't have external evidence to prove that your theory about these lying signals is correct or not. So currently, there's no real technology or piece of technology or technique or anything that's capable of reliably determining whether somebody is telling the truth or not. Of course, I don't want to undermine everything that professional interrogators or trained psychologists are saying, because there is in fact a tendency for people who are lying to give off lying signals. That is more than chance. But the scientific research demonstrates, as we saw in the Lie to Me slide, that most people who are not professionally trained are just only a little bit better than they would be by chance. Like if they flipped a coin, it would almost be as good as detecting through nonverbal or verbal techniques whether somebody's telling a lie. And so-called experts in deception really only fare a little bit better than those people. So you might, if you're a trained deception detector, you might be able to discern maybe 70% of the time if somebody's lying, 75 if you're really good, but you're still going to be missing all these times when people are lying and giving off no signs, and all those times when people are actually giving off signs and are telling the truth. So you're focusing primarily on this cell right here, ignoring all the other contradictory evidence. Now, the reason why these kinds of so-called experts, continue in their pseudoscientific techniques of deception is because they're subjective and open to interpretation. And that's beneficial if you have subjective interpretations. You can confirm whatever biases you already have. And so-called analysts can then shape the character of the results in favor of prevailing political winds or to favor some preferred narrative. They can provide so-called evidence to suggest that, oh, in fact, this is true, and you should pursue this line of interrogation, or you should not trust that piece of evidence, or you should not trust what they're saying because I've picked up on some lying signals they're giving. At best, in any given situation, you should use this perhaps as some evidence to maybe further pursue a line of investigation, but certainly don't put any real trust or stock in the words of a so-called lie detector, because these trained lie detectors really aren't much better than an untrained individual, and that's not much better than chance.